the man who stood outside every night. A man begins noticing the same person standing outside his house every night at exactly 3:00 a.m. The figure never moves, never knocks, just stands there. One night, he finally goes outside to confront him. But when he gets close, he realizes the man has no face. The voice from the attic. A family moves into a new house and starts hearing strange noises coming from the attic every night. Footsteps, scratching. Then one night they hear a whisper, "Help me." But when they open the attic door, no one is there. The man in the security camera. A store owner checks his security cameras late at night. On one of the cameras, he sees a man slowly walking through the store. But all the doors are locked. When he replays the footage, the man suddenly stops and looks directly into the camera. Then he starts smiling. The room that was never there. A traveler checks into a hotel for the night. While exploring the hallway, he accidentally enters room 408. Inside the room, everything feels strange and cold. The next morning, he asks the receptionist about the room. She looks confused. The hotel doesn't have a room 408. The midnight passenger. An Uber driver picks up a passenger in the middle of the night. The passenger asks to be taken to an old cemetery outside the city. When the driver arrives and turns around, the back seat is empty. Later, he checks the app. The ride never existed. The whispering phone. A woman hears strange whispering sounds coming from her phone late at night. It sounds like someone quietly calling her name. But her phone screen shows no active call. The whisper continues, getting closer, almost as if someone is standing beside her. The girl in the school hallway. A night security guard at a school keeps seeing a young girl walking down the hallway after midnight. Whenever he approaches her, she disappears. Later, he learns something disturbing. A student died in that school years ago, and the description matches the girl he keeps seeing. The knock from the window. A man wakes up in the middle of the night to hear someone knocking on his window. At first, he thinks it's a tree branch, but the knocking continues every night. Then he realizes something terrifying. His apartment is on the 5th floor. The shadow that waits. A man notices a strange shadow appearing on his bedroom wall every night. It looks like someone standing outside his window. But when he looks outside, no one is there. Then one night, he notices something horrifying. The shadow is slowly moving inside the room. The train that didn't stop. A tired commuter accidentally boards the last train of the night. But the train never stops at any station. The passengers inside sit silently, all staring toward the dark tunnel ahead, as if they already know where the train is going. The doorbell at 3 a.m. Every night at exactly 3:00 a.m., a man's doorbell rings. But when he checks the doorbell camera, no one is there. One night, the camera records something strange. A hand appears from below the door, pressing the bell. The thing under the bed. A young boy hears scratching sounds under his bed late at night. He looks underneath. Nothing. But when he climbs back into bed, a voice whispers from the darkness below. "Thanks for checking." The voice from the attic. True horror story. The Harris family had just moved into an old house on the edge of a quiet town. The house was beautiful, but it was clearly very old. The wooden floors creaked when you walked across them, and the walls had the kind of silence that made every small sound feel louder. But the house had something else. An attic. A large, dark attic above the 2nd floor. The real estate agent had mentioned it briefly during the house tour. "Just an old storage attic," she said casually. At the time, it didn't seem important. But within a week of moving in, strange things started happening. Every night around 2:30 a.m., something could be heard from above. At first it sounded like small movements, soft footsteps, slow dragging sounds. The parents assumed it was just the house settling. Old houses make noise all the time. But the sounds continued every single night. One evening, the father, Daniel, decided to check the attic. He pulled down the ladder and climbed up with a flashlight. The attic was dusty and filled with old wooden beams. There were a few empty boxes left behind by previous owners. But nothing else. No animals. No open windows. Nothing that could explain the sounds. Daniel climbed back down and told his family it was probably just the wind. But the noises didn't stop. In fact, they got worse. A few nights later, Daniel woke up suddenly. This time the sound was louder. Clear footsteps, walking slowly across the attic floor. Step, step, step. Daniel sat up in bed, listening. His wife woke up too. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Daniel nodded. The footsteps stopped. Then something else happened. A faint scratching sound began, as if someone was slowly dragging their fingers across the wood above them. Daniel grabbed a flashlight and went into the hallway. The attic ladder was still closed. The house was completely dark and quiet. He stood there for a moment. Then he heard it. A voice, very faint, almost like a whisper, coming from above. "Hello." Daniel froze. The whisper came again. "Soft. Weak. Help me." His heart began pounding. Daniel slowly pulled down the attic ladder and climbed up. The attic looked exactly the same as before. Empty. Silent. The flashlight beam moved across the dusty floor. Nothing. No one. No footprints. No movement. But just as he was about to climb down, he heard the whisper again. This time right behind him. "Don't leave." Daniel spun around quickly. The attic was completely empty. The next morning, Daniel spoke with an elderly neighbor who had lived in the area for decades. When he mentioned the attic, the old man became quiet. Then he said something strange. "Before you moved in, another family lived there." Daniel asked what happened to them. The neighbor hesitated, then answered slowly. They had a son. One night he disappeared. No one ever found him. Daniel asked where the boy was last seen. The old man looked up at the roof of the house. Then he said quietly, "They said the last place he was heard was the attic." That night the Harris family slept with the attic ladder locked. But around 2:30 a.m. the scratching sound returned, followed by the whisper. "Soft. Weak." Still asking the same question. "Can someone help me?" The man in the security camera, true horror story. Michael owned a small convenience store in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't a big store, but it stayed open late and served people from nearby apartments and offices. Most nights, Michael closed the store around midnight. After locking the doors, he would sit in the back office and check the security cameras before going home. The system had 8 cameras placed around the store. 1 for the entrance, 2 for the aisles, 1 for the storage room, and several outside. Usually, nothing interesting ever happened. Just empty aisles and quiet shelves. But one night, something appeared on the screen. It was around 12:45 a.m. Michael had already locked the front door and turned off most of the lights. The store was dark except for the emergency lighting. He sat in the office chair and began scrolling through the camera feeds. Everything looked normal. Camera 1 showed the front entrance. Camera 2 showed the snack aisle. Camera 3 showed the drinks refrigerator. Then he looked at camera 4 and froze. There was someone standing in the middle of the store. A man, tall, wearing dark clothes. Michael leaned closer to the screen. That couldn't be possible. He had personally locked the door just 15 minutes ago. He quickly stood up and looked through the small window that connected the office to the store. The store looked empty. No one there. He looked back at the monitor. The man was still on camera 4, standing completely still. In the middle of the aisle, Michael grabbed a flashlight and slowly walked out of the office. The store was silent. He checked the aisle where the man had been standing. Nothing. No one. He checked behind the shelves. He checked the storage room. Everything was empty. Confused, Michael returned to the office and checked the camera again. Now the man was gone. Michael shook his head. Maybe the camera had glitched. Maybe the image had frozen. He decided to replay the recording. The footage rewound to 12:43 a.m. The store was empty. Then suddenly, the man appeared. Not walking in. Not entering through the door. Just appearing. Standing in the middle of the aisle. Michael felt his stomach tighten. He kept watching. The man slowly turned his head. Then he looked directly into the camera. For several seconds he just stared. Then the man began to smile. Slowly. A wide, unnatural smile. Michael felt chills run down his spine. Then the screen flickered. For just a moment, all the cameras went black. When the image returned, the store was empty again. No man. No movement. Just quiet aisles. Michael immediately checked the door. Still locked. The next morning, he called the security company to inspect the system. The technician checked every camera and every wire. Everything worked perfectly. Before leaving, the technician asked Michael one question. Did this happen around 12:43 a.m.? Michael nodded slowly. The technician looked uncomfortable. Then he said something strange. You're not the first business owner on this street to report that. Michael asked what he meant. The technician hesitated, then answered quietly. Several cameras in this area have recorded the same man. Michael stared at him. Who is he? The technician shook his head. No one knows. Then he added one last thing. They say the cameras only see him after closing time. That night, Michael watched the camera screens more carefully than ever. The store stayed empty. The aisles stayed silent. But just before midnight, camera 4 flickered. And for a split second, the man appeared again, standing exactly where he had been before, looking straight into the camera, smiling. The room that was never their true horror story. Daniel had been traveling for work for years. Because of his job, he stayed in hotels almost every week. Most hotels felt the same to him: quiet hallways, identical rooms, and long nights alone. So when he checked into the Ridgeway Hotel during a business trip, nothing seemed unusual at first. The building was old but elegant. Soft yellow lights lit the long hallways. The receptionist handed Daniel his key card. Room 407, she said with a polite smile. Daniel took the key and headed upstairs. The hallway on the 4th floor was completely silent. Soft carpet covered the floor, making his footsteps almost soundless. He walked past several doors. He unlocked his room, dropped his bag inside, and sat down on the bed. After a long day of travel, He felt exhausted. But after a few minutes, he realized he had forgotten something in his car. So he left the room and walked back down the hallway. As he passed the doors again, something caught his attention. At the very end of the hallway was another door. The number on it read 408. Daniel frowned. He was sure that door hadn't been there before. Maybe he had just missed it earlier. Curious, he walked closer. The hallway felt strangely colder near the end. The door looked older than the others. The paint was slightly chipped, and the number plate looked worn. Daniel tried the handle. To his surprise, the door slowly opened. Inside was a hotel room. But something felt wrong immediately. The lights inside the room were dim. The furniture looked outdated. The air inside felt cold and heavy. Daniel stepped inside carefully. The room was quiet. Too quiet. There was a bed, a small desk, and a mirror on the wall. But everything looked older, almost like it belonged in a hotel from decades ago. Daniel suddenly felt uneasy. He turned to leave. But before he could step out, the door behind him slammed shut. Daniel jumped. He quickly grabbed the handle and pulled. The door wouldn't open. His heart started pounding. The lights inside the room flickered. For a moment, the room went completely dark. Then the lights returned. Daniel looked toward the mirror and froze. In the mirror's reflection, someone was standing behind him. A pale figure, watching him. Daniel spun around. The room was empty. The figure was gone. Panicking, Daniel pulled the door handle again. This time the door opened easily. He rushed back into the hallway. The hallway looked normal again. Bright lights, soft carpet, identical doors. But when Daniel looked back toward the end of the hall, the door labeled 408 was gone. There was only a blank wall. Daniel stood there in shock. The next morning, he went to the front desk. "Excuse me," he said to the receptionist. "Where is room 408? The receptionist looked confused. "Sir, this hotel doesn't have a room 408. Daniel felt a chill. "What do you mean?" She pointed to the hallway map behind the desk. The fourth floor ended at room 407. There was no space for another room. Daniel didn't argue. He simply checked out early and left the hotel. But before leaving, he looked up one last time at the fourth floor windows. And for a moment, he thought he saw someone standing in one of them, watching him from a room that shouldn't exist. The Midnight Passenger, true horror story. David had been driving for a rideshare company for almost 3 years. Most of his rides happened late at night. Bars closing, airports, late workers heading home. He had seen all kinds of strange passengers. But there was one ride he never forgot. It happened on a cold night in October. The clock in his car read 2:17 a.m. The streets were mostly empty. David had just dropped off a passenger and was about to end his shift when a new ride request appeared on his phone. The pickup location was only a few blocks away. The destination wasn't shown yet. David accepted the ride. A few minutes later, he pulled up to a quiet street corner. There were no streetlights nearby, only the faint glow from a distant building. At first, he thought the passenger hadn't arrived yet. Then he noticed someone standing near the sidewalk. A man, tall, wearing a long dark coat. The man slowly walked toward the car and opened the back door. He sat down quietly. David glanced in the rearview mirror. The man's face looked pale, almost unusually pale. "Where to?" David asked. The passenger spoke softly. Maple Hill Cemetery. David blinked. He knew the place. It was an old cemetery, about 15 minutes outside the city. It wasn't a normal destination at that hour. But David had learned not to ask too many questions. He started driving. The ride was strangely quiet. Most passengers talked or checked their phones. But this man just sat still, looking straight ahead. David tried to make small talk. "Late night visit?" he asked. The man didn't answer. David looked at him in the mirror again. The passenger's eyes seemed unfocused, almost distant. The rest of the drive passed in silence. Eventually, the road became darker as they left the city. Tall trees surrounded the narrow road. Finally, the cemetery gate appeared ahead. David slowed the car and stopped near the entrance. "We're here," he said. No response. David glanced at the mirror. The back seat was empty. David's heart skipped. He turned around quickly. The seat behind him was completely empty. The door hadn't opened. There had been no sound. The passenger was simply gone. David stepped out of the car, looking around. The road was silent. The cemetery gate stood quietly in the darkness. No one was there. Confused, David returned to the car and checked his phone. The ride was still active. But something strange caught his attention. The passenger name field was blank. No name. No profile picture. Just an empty space. Then suddenly, the ride ended by itself. No payment. No record. David tried refreshing the app. The ride was gone from his history, as if it had never happened. The next morning, David mentioned the experience to another driver at a coffee shop. The older driver listened quietly. Then he asked one question. Did he ask to go to Maple Hill? David nodded slowly. The older driver sighed. "You're not the first one." David felt uneasy. "What do you mean?" The driver stirred his coffee. "Years ago, a man died in a car accident near that cemetery. Some drivers say they still pick him up. David never drove near Maple Hill again. But sometimes late at night, when he checks his rearview mirror, he still has the feeling that someone might be sitting in the back seat." The Whispering Phone True Horror Story. Sarah lived alone in a small apartment in the city. She worked late shifts at a marketing company, which meant she often returned home around midnight. Most nights followed the same routine. She would unlock the door, drop her bag on the couch, and spend some time scrolling through her phone before going to sleep. Nothing unusual ever happened. Until one night. It was almost 1:40 a.m. when Sarah finally got into bed. The apartment was quiet. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Sarah was just about to fall asleep when her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She picked it up, but the screen was completely blank. No message. No notification. Confused, she placed the phone back down. A few seconds later, the phone buzzed again. Sarah frowned. She checked the screen again. Still nothing. No notifications, she muttered to herself. She assumed it was just a glitch. But then something strange happened. The phone speaker turned on by itself, and a faint sound came through. Static. Very soft. Almost like someone whispering through a weak connection. Sarah held the phone closer to her ear. "Hello," she said quietly. There was no answer. Only static. Then slowly, a voice emerged from the noise. Very quiet. Almost impossible to hear. But the voice said something clearly. "Sarah." Sarah froze. Her heart started beating faster. The voice had said her name. She pulled the phone away and looked at the screen again. There was still no call. No active connection. No number displayed. Just the home screen. Then the whisper returned. "Sarah." This time it sounded closer. More clear. Sarah quickly opened the call history. Nothing. No incoming calls. No missed calls. The whisper continued through the speaker. "Sarah, can you hear me?" Her hands began shaking. "Who is this?" she asked. There was a long pause. Then the voice spoke again. Soft. Almost sad. "Why didn't you answer before?" Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "I don't know who you are," she said. The whisper grew slightly louder. "You used to." The room suddenly felt colder. Sarah turned on the bedside lamp. The warm light filled the room. The whisper stopped immediately. Silence. Her phone speaker turned off. The screen went completely normal again. Sarah sat there for several minutes, staring at the phone. Finally, she convinced herself it had to be some kind of technical glitch. Maybe an app malfunction. Eventually, she turned off the light and tried to sleep. But around 3:02 a.m., her phone buzzed again. This time, there was a message. Unknown number. She slowly opened it. The message contained only 4 words. "I'm standing behind you." Sarah's heart nearly stopped. She slowly turned her head. The bedroom was empty. Nothing behind her. Just the quiet room. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. "Don't turn around again." Sarah grabbed her phone and ran out of the apartment. She spent the rest of the night at a friend's house. The next day, she contacted her phone company. They checked her call logs. There were no incoming calls at the time she described. No messages from unknown numbers. Nothing at all. But when Sarah opened her phone again that night, the messages were still there. The last one appeared a few seconds later. "I told you not to turn around." The girl in the school hallway, true horror story. Robert had recently started working as a night security guard at an old high school. The building had been standing for more than 50 years, and it had the kind of quiet atmosphere that felt different after dark. During the day, the school was filled with noise. Students laughing, teachers talking, lockers slamming. But at night, the building felt completely different. Silent, empty, almost like the school itself was asleep. Robert's shift started at 10 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m. His job was simple. Walk through the hallways every hour, check that all the doors were locked, and watch the security cameras in the office. For the first few weeks, nothing unusual happened. Most nights were boring. Until one night in November. It was around 1:15 a.m. when Robert began his routine patrol. The hallways were dimly lit by the emergency lights. Rows of lockers stretched along both sides of the corridor. Robert walked slowly, shining his flashlight ahead. Everything looked normal. He reached the end of the hallway and turned the corner. That's when he saw her. A girl. Standing near the lockers. She looked about 14 or 15 years old. Long dark hair covered part of her face. She was wearing what looked like a school uniform. Robert frowned. Students weren't allowed in the building at night. "Hey," he called out. "What are you doing here?" The girl didn't respond. She simply stood there, looking down at the floor. Robert walked closer. "School's closed," he said. "You need to leave." The girl slowly turned and began walking down the hallway. Robert sighed and followed her. "Hey, wait." The girl walked calmly toward the corner of the hallway. Then she turned it. Robert reached the corner a few seconds later. But when he turned, the hallway was empty. Completely empty. There were no doors nearby. No classrooms. No places she could have entered. Robert looked around in confusion. "Hello," he called. No answer. The hallway remained silent. Robert returned to the security office and checked the camera recordings. Camera 3 showed the hallway where he had seen the girl. He rewound the footage to 1:15 a.m. The video showed Robert walking down the hallway. But something was missing. The girl wasn't there. Robert stared at the screen. He rewound it again. The footage clearly showed him walking down the hallway, then suddenly stopping, as if he was talking to someone. But the camera showed nothing in front of him. Just empty space. Robert leaned back in his chair. His stomach felt uneasy. The next morning, Robert mentioned the incident to the school janitor. The janitor had been working there for more than 20 years. When Robert described the girl, the janitor became very quiet. "What did she look like?" the janitor asked. "Long dark hair," Robert said. "Maybe 15 years old." The janitor sighed. Then he said something that made Robert uncomfortable. "About 10 years ago, a student disappeared from this school." Robert frowned. "What happened to her?" The janitor shook his head. "No one knows." He paused, then added quietly, "But the last place she was seen was that hallway." Robert tried to ignore the story. But the following week, something happened again. At exactly 1:15 a.m., while watching the security cameras, he saw the girl walking slowly down the hallway. Camera 3 showed her clearly. Long dark hair, school uniform, moving slowly past the lockers. Robert stared at the screen. Then the girl stopped walking. She turned her head slowly and looked directly into the camera. For a moment, her face became visible. Her eyes looked empty. Then the screen flickered. When the image returned, the hallway was empty again. Robert finished his shift that night. But the next day, he submitted his resignation. Because sometimes, even when a school is closed, some students never really leave. The knock from the window, true horror story. Jason lived in a small apartment on the 5th floor of an old building. The building was quiet most of the time, and Jason liked that. After long days at work, he enjoyed coming home to a peaceful place where nothing disturbed him. His bedroom window faced a narrow alley behind the building. From his window, all he could see were the backs of other tall buildings and the occasional glow of distant streetlights. There was nothing outside his window that anyone could stand on. No balcony. No fire escape. Just empty air. Which is why what happened one night made no sense. It was around 2:40 a.m. when Jason suddenly woke up. At first, he thought he had heard something in his dream. Then he heard it again. Knock, knock. Jason slowly opened his eyes. The sound had come from somewhere close. He sat up in bed and listened. The apartment was quiet. Then it happened again. Knock, knock, knock. This time the sound was clearer. It was coming from the window. Jason frowned. He looked toward the glass. The curtain moved slightly from the night breeze. But there was nothing outside. "No way," Jason muttered. He assumed it must be a tree branch hitting the glass. But that didn't make sense either. There were no trees anywhere near the building. Jason got out of bed and walked toward the window. He slowly pulled the curtain aside. Outside was nothing but darkness and the distant lights of the city. He checked the glass. No branches. No birds. Nothing that could explain the sound. Jason shook his head and went back to bed. Eventually, he fell asleep again. The next night, the same thing happened. This time at 2:39 a.m. Jason woke up suddenly. Knock, knock. His heart started beating faster. The sound came again. Knock, knock, knock. Jason sat up immediately. Now he knew it wasn't his imagination. The knocking was real. He slowly looked toward the window. The curtain moved slightly. The glass reflected the faint light from the room. Jason didn't move. The knocking stopped. He waited for several seconds. Then he heard something else. A faint scratching sound, as if someone's fingernails were slowly sliding across the glass. Jason felt a cold chill run down his spine. He grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight. Slowly, he walked toward the window again. The scratching stopped. Jason took a deep breath and pulled the curtain open quickly. The window showed only darkness. Empty air. 5 floors above the ground. No ledge. No place for anyone to stand. Jason leaned forward and looked down. The alley below was empty. He closed the curtain and returned to bed. But he didn't sleep much that night. On the third night, Jason decided to record the window. He placed his phone on the desk facing the glass. Then he turned off the lights and waited. Midnight passed. Then 1 a.m. Then 2 a.m. Jason sat quietly in the dark room. At 2:39 a.m. the knocking returned. Knock, knock, knock. Jason's heart began racing. He stayed still, watching the window. The curtain moved slightly. Then something touched the glass from the outside. A shape, like the outline of a hand, pressing slowly against the window. Jason felt frozen. The hand shape slid slowly across the glass, then disappeared. Jason grabbed his phone and rushed to the window. He pulled the curtain aside. Nothing. The sky outside was empty. But when he looked down at the phone recording later that morning, he saw something that made him move out of the apartment immediately. The video clearly showed the window. Then at 2:39 a.m., something appeared outside the glass. A pale hand, pressing against the window, 5 floors above the ground. And just before the video ended, a face slowly moved into view, looking directly into the room. The shadow that waits true horror story. Ethan lived alone in a small apartment on the edge of the city. The building was old, but it was quiet and affordable. Most nights Ethan stayed up late working on his laptop. His bedroom was simple. A bed against the wall, a small desk near the window, and a single lamp that cast a soft light across the room. For months, nothing unusual happened. Until one night, Ethan noticed something strange on his bedroom wall. A shadow. At first, it didn't seem important. Shadows appear all the time from lights outside. Cars passing by. Street lights. Moving branches. But this shadow was different. It looked like the outline of a person, standing near the window. Ethan looked toward the window. There was no one outside, just the dark street below. He ignored it and went back to work. But the next night, the shadow appeared again. At the exact same time, 2:11 a.m. Ethan only noticed because he had checked the clock. The shadow appeared slowly on the wall. Tall, still, shaped like someone standing near the window. But when Ethan looked outside, the street was empty. The shadow stayed there for almost a minute, then slowly faded away. Over the next few nights, Ethan began paying closer attention. The shadow appeared every night, always at 2:11 a.m., always in the same spot. and always looking like a person standing outside his window. But the window faced a narrow alley. No balcony, no ledge, no place where anyone could stand. The shadow should not have existed. One night, Ethan decided to test something. Before going to bed, he closed the curtains completely. If the shadow came from outside light, it shouldn't appear anymore. He turned off the lamp and waited. The room was dark and silent. Ethan watched the clock on his phone. 2:10 a.m. Then 2:11 a.m. Slowly the shadow appeared again. On the wall. Even though the curtains were closed, Ethan felt his chest tighten. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, waiting. Then something changed. For the first time, the shadow moved slightly. It looked like it was leaning closer, as if someone was slowly stepping into the room. Ethan jumped up and turned on the light. The shadow disappeared instantly. The wall was empty again. The next night, Ethan stayed awake again. This time, he didn't close the curtains. He wanted to see what was causing the shadow. At 2:11 a.m., the shadow appeared again. But this time, something was different. It was closer to the bed. Closer than before. Ethan felt his heart pounding. He grabbed his phone and recorded the wall. The shadow stayed there for almost 30 seconds. Then slowly, it moved forward again. Just a few inches, but enough to notice. Ethan immediately turned on the lamp. The shadow vanished. The following morning, Ethan showed the video to his neighbor. The neighbor watched the clip quietly, then asked a strange question. "How long have you lived here?" "About 6 months, Ethan replied. The neighbor nodded slowly, then said something unsettling. "The last tenant who lived in your apartment moved out suddenly." Ethan frowned. "Why?" The neighbor hesitated, then answered quietly. "He said he kept seeing someone standing in his room at night." Ethan felt a cold chill. "What happened to him?" The neighbor shook his head. "No one knows." That night, Ethan decided he had seen enough. He packed his things and prepared to leave the apartment the next day. But before going to sleep, he looked once more at the wall. The room was quiet. The clock read 2:10 a.m. Ethan looked away, then looked back at the wall. The shadow was already there. But this time, it wasn't standing near the window anymore. It was standing right beside the bed. The train that didn't stop, true horror story. Mark worked late shifts at a small office in the city. Most nights he left work around midnight and took the subway home. Usually the train was crowded during the day. But at night, especially after midnight, the stations became quiet and almost empty. One night after finishing a long shift, Mark arrived at the subway station around 1:05 a.m. The station was nearly deserted. The bright fluorescent lights flickered slightly above the empty platform. Mark checked the digital sign above the tracks. Last train arriving in 2 minutes. He sighed with relief. If he missed this train, he would have to wait until morning. A cold wind rushed through the tunnel. Moments later, the train arrived with a loud screech. The doors opened. Mark stepped inside. The train car was strangely empty. Not a single passenger in sight. Mark sat near the middle of the car and pulled out his phone. The doors closed. The train slowly began moving into the dark tunnel. For a few minutes, everything seemed normal. The train moved through the underground tunnel with the usual rattling sound. Mark checked the map above the door. The next station was only 3 minutes away. But 3 minutes passed. Then 5. Then 10. The train didn't stop. Mark frowned. He looked up again. The map light still showed the next station ahead. But the train kept moving. The tunnel outside the window remained completely dark. No station lights. No platforms. Nothing. Mark stood up and walked toward the door connecting the next train car. He pushed it open and stepped inside. That's when he realized something strange. There were passengers in the next car. 4 people sat quietly on the seats. But something felt wrong about them. They were sitting completely still. None of them were talking. None of them were using phones. They were all staring in the same direction, toward the front of the train. Mark sat down across from them. "Excuse me," he said. "Do you know when the next station is?" No one answered. The passengers didn't even blink. Mark felt uneasy. He looked toward the front window of the train car. Beyond the glass was only darkness. The train continued moving deeper into the tunnel. Then one of the passengers slowly turned their head. An older man sitting near the window. His face looked pale. His eyes looked tired. He spoke quietly. "This train doesn't stop anymore." Mark frowned. "What do you mean?" The man looked back toward the darkness ahead. "It passed its last station years ago." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you talking about?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he pointed toward the window. Mark looked outside. For a brief moment, the train passed something in the darkness. A platform. But it looked abandoned. Broken lights flickered above cracked tiles. Dust covered everything. And a faded sign on the wall read the name of a station that had been closed decades earlier. Mark turned back toward the passengers. But now all 4 of them were looking at him. Completely silent. Completely still. The older man spoke again. "You weren't supposed to get on this train." The lights inside the car flickered suddenly. The train began slowing down. Mark felt relief. Finally, a station. But when the train stopped, the doors did not open. The tunnel outside remained completely dark. The older man stood up slowly. "This is where we stay," he said quietly. Mark's heart was racing. "What do you mean?" The man looked at him. "You can still leave." At that moment, the train lights flickered again. The doors suddenly opened. Mark didn't hesitate. He ran out of the train. The platform outside looked old and abandoned. Dust covered the floor. Broken signs hung from the ceiling. Mark ran up the stairs as fast as he could. When he finally reached the street above, the city looked normal again. Cars passed by. People walked along the sidewalks. Mark turned around and looked back toward the subway entrance. The station sign above the stairs showed a name he had never seen before. Later that night, Mark searched for that station online. What he discovered made him feel cold. The station had been closed over 20 years ago, after a train accident deep in the tunnel. And according to the reports, the train involved in that accident never reached the next station. The doorbell at 3 a.m. True horror story. Kevin lived alone in a small suburban house at the end of a quiet street. The neighborhood was peaceful, and nothing unusual ever happened there. Kevin worked from home as a graphic designer, which meant he often stayed up late at night finishing projects. One night, after hours of work, he finally shut down his computer and went to bed. The clock beside his bed read 2:48 a.m. Within minutes, he fell asleep. But suddenly, ding-dong, Kevin's eyes opened immediately. He looked toward the clock. 3:00 a.m. Someone had rung his doorbell. Kevin frowned. Who would ring a doorbell at this hour? He got out of bed and walked toward the front door. Before opening it, he looked through the peephole. The porch was empty. No one stood outside. Kevin opened the door slowly and stepped onto the porch. The street was silent. Not a single car passed by. The cold night air filled the quiet neighborhood. Confused, Kevin closed the door and went back to bed. The next night, it happened again. Kevin had just fallen asleep when the sound woke him. Ding dong. He looked at the clock again. 3:00 a.m. Kevin felt annoyed this time. Someone must be playing a prank. He grabbed his phone and checked the doorbell camera. The notification read, "Motion detected." Kevin opened the video recording. The camera showed the front porch clearly. But no one was there. The doorbell rang by itself. Kevin replayed the clip several times. Then he noticed something strange. Just before the doorbell rang, a shadow passed across the camera. But there was no person visible. On the third night, Kevin decided to stay awake. He sat in the living room with the lights off, watching the doorbell camera on his phone. The clock slowly approached 3:00 a.m. 2:58. 2:59. Kevin stared at the screen. Then exactly at 3:00 a.m. Ding dong. Kevin jumped slightly. He looked at the camera feed. The porch was empty. But something else appeared on the screen. Near the bottom of the door, a hand. A pale hand slowly reached up from below the camera view. The hand pressed the doorbell, then slowly slid back down. Kevin felt his heart pounding. The camera angle only showed the upper half of the door. Anything below the camera couldn't be seen. Someone could have been crouching right outside. Kevin grabbed a flashlight and rushed to the door. He opened it quickly. The porch was empty. But when he looked down, he saw something that made his stomach twist. 2 faint handprints were visible on the door, low near the bottom, as if someone had been standing very close to the ground. The next morning, Kevin visited his neighbor across the street. The neighbor had lived there for many years. When Kevin explained the strange doorbell incidents, the neighbor became quiet. Then he said something unsettling. "Did it happen around 3 in the morning?" Kevin nodded. The neighbor sighed. "Years ago, there was a boy who lived in that house." Kevin felt uneasy. What happened to him? The neighbor looked toward Kevin's house, then said quietly, "He disappeared one night." Kevin asked what that had to do with the doorbell. The neighbor answered slowly. The last thing his parents heard was the doorbell ringing. That night, Kevin unplugged the doorbell system completely. No electricity, no power, no way it could ring. He went to bed hoping the strange events were over. But at exactly 3:00 a.m., Kevin woke up again. Not from the doorbell, but from a soft knocking sound, coming from the bottom of the front door. Slow, gentle, almost like someone small was trying to get inside. The thing under the bed, true horror story. When Daniel was 10 years old, he was terrified of the dark. Like many children, he believed there might be something hiding under his bed at night. His parents always told him the same thing. "There's nothing under there. It's just your imagination." For years, Daniel tried to believe them. Until the night something happened that he never forgot. It was a rainy night in late autumn. The wind rattled the windows of their old house, and the sound of rain tapping against the roof filled the silence. Daniel lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The small night lamp beside his bed gave the room a soft yellow glow. Eventually, he began to fall asleep. But suddenly, he heard something. A faint sound. Scratch, scratch. Daniel opened his eyes. The sound seemed to come from beneath the bed. He held his breath and listened. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then the sound came again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Daniel slowly sat up. His heart was beating faster now. He looked toward the edge of the bed. The darkness underneath looked deeper than usual. "Mom," he called quietly. No answer. The rain outside grew louder. The scratching continued. Daniel swallowed nervously. He slowly leaned over the edge of the bed. The light from the lamp barely reached the floor. The space under the bed was mostly shadow. "Hello," he whispered. The scratching stopped instantly. The silence felt even worse. Daniel stared into the darkness for several seconds. Nothing moved. Finally, he leaned a little further down and looked underneath. There was nothing there. Just the wooden floor and a few old toys. Daniel sighed with relief. "It was nothing," he muttered. He climbed back into bed and pulled the blanket over himself. But just as he began to relax, a voice whispered from beneath the bed. Very soft. Very close. "Thanks for checking." Daniel froze. Every muscle in his body went stiff. The voice sounded like a child, but not quite normal. It sounded wrong, almost like someone trying to imitate a human voice. Daniel slowly turned his head toward the edge of the bed again. His heart was pounding in his ears. He didn't want to look, but he couldn't stop himself. Very slowly, he leaned over the side again. The floor under the bed looked empty. But then, something moved in the darkness. Two pale eyes opened, looking directly at him. Daniel screamed and jumped back onto the bed. He ran out of the room and into the hallway. His parents rushed out of their bedroom. "What happened?" his mother asked. "There's something under my bed," Daniel cried. His father grabbed a flashlight and went into the room. Daniel watched nervously from the doorway. His father knelt down and shined the light under the bed. Nothing. The space was completely empty. "There's nothing here," his father said. Daniel slowly walked back into the room. The bed looked normal again. The floor was clear. No eyes. No movement. His parents convinced him it must have been a nightmare. Eventually, Daniel went back to sleep. But years later, Daniel still remembers one detail from that night. When he first looked under the bed, he saw his own reflection in the small mirror toy on the floor. But when he climbed back onto the bed and heard the whisper, he realized something terrifying. He had already checked under the bed once. So whatever whispered to him wasn't there when he looked the first time. The Man in the Mirror True Horror Story. Lisa had recently moved into a small apartment in an old building downtown. The apartment wasn't fancy, but it was affordable and close to her workplace. The building itself had clearly been standing for decades. The wooden floors creaked when you walked across them, and the walls were thick enough to make the rooms feel strangely quiet. But there was one thing Lisa noticed immediately after moving in. The bathroom mirror. It was large, old, and permanently fixed to the wall. The edges of the glass looked slightly worn, almost cloudy from age. At first, Lisa didn't think much about it. It was just a mirror. But a few nights later, something happened that made her see it differently. Lisa worked late shifts at a nearby restaurant. One night she arrived home around 1:20 a.m. The building hallway was empty, and the lights flickered slightly as she walked to her apartment. After unlocking the door, she went straight to the bathroom to wash her face. The apartment was silent. She turned on the bathroom light and looked into the mirror. Her reflection stared back normally. Tired eyes. Messy hair. Nothing unusual. Lisa turned on the sink and splashed water on her face. Then she looked up again. For a brief moment, something felt strange. Her reflection seemed delayed. She tilted her head slightly. The reflection followed, but just a fraction of a second slower. Lisa frowned. "Maybe I'm just tired," she muttered. She turned off the sink and left the bathroom. The next night, the same thing happened again. Lisa stood in front of the mirror, brushing her teeth. As she moved, her reflection seemed to follow a moment later. Not instantly, just slightly delayed. It was subtle, almost impossible to notice unless you were paying attention. Lisa leaned closer to the mirror. Her reflection leaned forward too. But again, a fraction of a second late. A chill ran down her spine. She stepped back quickly. Her reflection copied the movement. This time perfectly normal. Lisa shook her head and laughed nervously. Okay, that was weird. But she convinced herself it was just her imagination. A few nights later, something happened that Lisa could not explain. She came home late again and went straight to the bathroom. The mirror reflected the dim light from the hallway behind her. Lisa washed her face and looked up. Everything looked normal, until she noticed something behind her. In the mirror, a shadow, standing in the hallway. Lisa froze. Slowly she turned around. The hallway was empty. She looked back at the mirror. The shadow was gone. Her heart started beating faster. "Hello," she called softly. No answer. The apartment remained completely silent. After that night, Lisa tried avoiding the mirror as much as possible. But one evening, while getting ready for bed, she accidentally looked at it again. And this time, her reflection wasn't alone. Behind her in the mirror stood a tall man. His face was pale. His eyes were dark. He stood completely still, watching her. Lisa gasped and spun around. The bathroom was empty. No one stood behind her. Her hands began shaking. She slowly turned back toward the mirror. Now it showed only her reflection again. Nothing else. The next morning, Lisa spoke with the elderly landlord who lived on the first floor. When she mentioned the mirror, the old man's expression changed. "You saw something in it, didn't you?" he asked quietly. Lisa felt uneasy. "What do you mean?" The landlord sighed. "That mirror has been in that apartment for over 40 years. Lisa waited for him to continue. The old man spoke slowly. "Many years ago, a man lived there alone." Lisa asked what happened to him. The landlord looked down for a moment, then said quietly, "They found him dead in that bathroom." Lisa felt cold. What does that have to do with the mirror? The landlord looked at her. "They said when the police arrived. The mirror showed something standing behind them." Lisa moved out of the apartment 2 days later. But before leaving, she glanced at the mirror one last time. Her reflection looked normal. The bathroom was empty. But just before she turned away, her reflection slowly smiled. Even though Lisa hadn't. The last bus stop, true horror story. Kevin had been working late shifts for several months. Every night he finished work around midnight and caught the last bus home. The bus stop was only a short walk from his office. It stood alone at the corner of a quiet street under a flickering streetlight. Most nights, Kevin was the only person waiting there. But one night something strange happened. It was around 12:50 a.m. when Kevin arrived at the bus stop. The street was silent. Most of the nearby shops were closed, and only a few cars passed by occasionally. Kevin sat down on the small metal bench beneath the streetlight. The wind blew softly through the empty street. A few minutes later, someone else arrived. A man. He walked slowly toward the bench and sat down at the far end. Kevin nodded politely. Late night, huh? The man didn't answer. Kevin assumed he simply didn't want to talk. The man sat very still, staring straight ahead at the road. After a moment, Kevin spoke again. You waiting for the last bus too? The man slowly nodded. But he still didn't speak. Something about the silence felt uncomfortable. Kevin looked at him briefly. The man's face looked pale under the streetlight. His expression was completely blank. Kevin quickly looked away. After several minutes, the sound of the bus engine approached from the distance. The headlights appeared around the corner. The bus slowly pulled up to the stop. Kevin stood up and stepped toward the door. Before boarding, he turned to the man. You coming? The man didn't move. He just kept staring at the road. Kevin shrugged and stepped onto the bus. The driver glanced at him. Long night, the driver asked. Yeah, Kevin replied. Kevin dropped his fare into the machine and took a seat near the front. The bus doors closed. Just before the bus pulled away, Kevin looked back toward the bus stop. The man was gone. The bench was empty. Kevin assumed the man must have walked away. A few minutes later, the bus driver spoke again. Who were you talking to back there? Kevin looked confused. What do you mean? At the bus stop, the driver said. You were talking to someone. Kevin nodded. Yeah, the guy sitting on the bench. The driver frowned. There was no one else there. Kevin felt a small chill. What? The driver shook his head. I've been driving this route for 10 years. You were the only person at that stop tonight. Kevin looked out the window toward the dark street behind them. The bus stop was already far away. The flickering streetlight illuminated the empty bench. No one stood there. No one had been there. Kevin turned back toward the driver. You're sure? The driver nodded slowly. Absolutely. The rest of the ride passed in silence. But just before Kevin reached his stop, something caught his attention. In the reflection of the bus window, he saw someone sitting in the seat behind him. Kevin slowly turned around. The seat was empty. He looked back at the window reflection. For a brief moment, the pale man from the bus stop was sitting directly behind him, staring at the road ahead. Then the reflection disappeared. The seat was empty again. Kevin got off the bus immediately at the next stop. And from that night on, he never waited for the last bus again. Because sometimes, the last passenger isn't someone you can see.